Formation and structure of the moon. Here are our learning goals. Explain the theory of the moon's formation. Describe the layers of the moon and label the following on a diagram of the moon's structure: crust, mantle, and core. Explain the formation of maria, highlands, craters, and regolith. Describe the moon's rotation and mass. All right, there's many possible explanations for how the moon formed. But when Apollo astronauts brought back samples of lunar rocks and scientists had a chance to study them, they looked for clues as to how the moon formed. And this is the most current thinking about how our moon formed. The best explanation is that a large planet-sized object, something about the size of Mars, collided with the Earth. And when it did, it knocked lots and lots of debris into orbit around the Earth. Gravity pulled that debris together to form the moon. As the debris orbited the Earth, the debris clumped together gradually and eventually formed our moon. So here is a picture showing a large object hitting the Earth and debris flying off. That debris went into orbit around the Earth, and gradually it clumped together. Here it's clumping together, and eventually it continued to clump together until the moon formed an orbit around the Earth. That's the current thinking and the best explanation we have for how we got our moon. After the moon formed, objects continued to continually impact the moon. It was constantly clobbered by lots and lots of things crashing into it. And like the early Earth, the early moon was liquid. It was molten. Heavier, denser materials sunk toward the center, and lighter, less dense materials floated toward the surface. Same thing that happened in the formation of the Earth. So the moon has three layers based on what the materials are made out of, the composition of the materials. So let's look at this diagram. The outermost part of the moon is the crust, and it's relatively thin. Beneath that is the mantle, and then in the center is the core. The core is made out of nickel and iron, just like the Earth, but it's relatively much smaller compared to the Earth's core. So hit pause, think of the answers to the questions, and when you're ready, hit play. So how was the moon formed? The moon was formed when a large Mars-sized object hit the Earth, scattered debris, which went into orbit around the Earth. The debris gradually clumped together to form the moon. And the moon has three layers: the crust, the mantle, and the core. Development of the moon. The moon has some features that we need to think about. One of them are called maria. As the moon cooled, the surface became solid, but things continually crashed into the moon, some very large things, and they made basically large dents or depressions in the basins, very big and deep depressions. And that also created mountains along the edge of where the collision occurred. The basins filled up with magma or lava from below that oozed up through cracks in the basin. Think about an egg. Inside the egg is a liquid. The outer surface is solid. What happens if you crack the egg? The liquid oozes up through the crack, doesn't it? Well, the same sort of thing happened on the moon. When large things hit the moon, they cracked the crust of the moon, and then liquid magma or lava oozed up through the cracks. And the basins completely filled with the magma, and the magma hardened, and they're what we call now the maria. The maria are the dark colored parts on the moon. So here's a diagram of the moon. You can see these dark areas here are the marias. Here's some that overlap. Basically what happened is some giant object comes flying in, hits the moon here, creates a big depression, creates all kinds of little cracks in the crust, and then liquid lava or magma oozed up from below, filled this in. The magma is made of different minerals than the crust of the moon, and it's darker, so these maria are darker. Another feature on the moon are called lunar highlands. The lunar highlands are the original crust of the moon that was not covered by magma. In other words, the areas that weren't hit by large objects are what we call the highlands. The highlands are made of lighter color rocks. They reflect more sunlight, so they're the light areas on the moon. Right, so these lighter areas, all this light area here, these are the lunar highlands. This is the original crust of the moon. These are the maria, where big impacts occurred and magma covered the crust, but this is the original crust. It's made of lighter colored rock, so it's light in color. The maria are filled up with magma, which is darker in color, and that's why they're darker. Of course, there are craters on the moon. Craters are just depressions caused by impacts. And another feature of the moon is the lunar soil, or moon dust. It's really not dirt like we have here on Earth, but it's more rock dust. And what happens is that there are millions and zillions of micrometeorites, tiny little things the size of sand grains, that are constantly hitting the surface of the moon. The moon doesn't have any atmosphere, so all these little tiny things that would be shooting stars in our sky actually hit the moon. They burn up in our atmosphere before they hit the Earth, but the moon having no atmosphere, they hit the moon. So rocks are constantly being pelted by little sand grain size or smaller particles called micrometeorites, and when they hit the rocks, the micrometeorites chip off little chunks. And over the last few billion years, they have created a relatively thick layer of rock dust. We call that Lunar Regolith. Here's a crater, just an impact depression, right? Here's another crater. You can see all these craters, they overlap each other. This part of the moon is just absolutely covered with craters. It's another pretty crater. And here's some moon dust, some lunar regolith. You can see footprints in it. This is an astronaut. He's got this little collection device, and he's going to scoop up some of this moon dust, some of this lunar regolith, so it can be studied back on Earth. All right, push pause. Think of the answers to the questions. When you're ready, push play. How are the maria on the moon formed? The moon was hit by large objects, which created dents or depressions in the crust. That also cracked up the crust, and then magma or lava oozed up from below and filled in the depression. The reason the maria are dark colored is because the magma is darker than the original crust of the moon. What are the lunar highlands? Lunar highlands are the original crust of the moon. The reason they're lighter in color is because they're made out of lighter colored rocks than the magma. And how was regolith formed, or moon dust formed? It's formed by the impact of micrometeorites constantly bombarding the moon and chipping off little chunks of rock. All right, we're going to quickly just look at some of the properties of the moon. It's about a quarter the size of the Earth. It has about 1/8 of the mass of the Earth. It's less dense than the Earth, and it has about 1/6 of the gravity of the Earth. Let's talk about exploration of the moon. Before men went to the moon, unmanned robotic spacecraft went there to gather information. Before you go somewhere like the moon, it'd be nice to know a lot about the moon so you don't end up landing in some terrible place. You need good maps so you can plot where you're going to land. So we sent unmanned robotic spacecraft there to get pictures and information. We actually landed some of them on the moon. This is one of the lunar landers that's landed, and it's checking out the lunar soil with this scooper and other things, and it's going to radio this information back to Earth. Now, men first landed on the moon July 1969. The name of the mission was Apollo 11, and 2 men landed on the moon. Their names were Neil Armstrong. He was the first man on the moon. and Buzz Aldrin was the second man on the moon. There were a total of 6 Apollo missions that landed on the moon. There's been 12 men walk on the moon. The last time we went to the moon was in December 1972. It's 40 years ago. And we haven't been back since. If you notice, Apollo 11, 12, 14, what happened to Apollo 13? Apollo 13 had a problem on their way to the moon. They had to abort the mission and come back to Earth, and they were very lucky that they didn't die.